There are 5 elements that have to be proven for voluntary manslaughter. All of them have to be proven for the defendant to get the defense. And because it's an affirmative defense, these elements are viewed from the defense perspective. You're going to hear it that way. So first, element number 1, defendant must intend to have killed the victim. Now you might be scratching your head at this point. You might be saying, well, wait a second. I was taught that malice for murder 2 is proven by the intent to kill. How can there be an intent to kill inside murder 2 and also an intent to kill in voluntary manslaughter? Actually, there's no real conflict. Here's why. I'm going to slightly tweak the mens rea of malice in murder 2 with intent to kill. And I'm going to say the following. For murder 2, we're going to say that malice can be proven by an intent to kill that's not justified, not excused, not mitigated. It's basically saying that malicious intent to kill is a naked intent to kill that doesn't have any justifying, excusing, or mitigating reasons. If it doesn't, we've got a good intent to kill for murder 2. Since this is an affirmative defense the defendant is seeking, often our defendant is going to say, yeah, I did intend to kill. He's not going to contest that. But he's going to be quick to point out that he formed that intent only because of circumstances that pushed him to do so. So that's element number 1. Next, defendant must show that he was in a heat of passion, that he was moved to kill. This element looks strictly at it from defendant's perspective. We call this the subjective test. It doesn't mean wishy-washy, could go either way. It means we look to see whether defendant himself was enraged or inflamed with passion. And usually this is very easy to prove. Most people who claim heat of passion demonstrate that they are in this inflamed passion situation. Here, in this case, we have a number of facts that show defendant was enraged, that he meets the subjective test. When he learned his child was molested, we learned he couldn't eat or sleep, he was seething with anger. All of these point towards the subjective test being satisfied. That's element number 2. The third element requires that the provocation has to have been adequate. That means that an average person would have been moved to kill when faced with these same circumstances. Because we're looking at it from the outside, we call this the objective test. We're looking at it from society's perspective, not from the defendant's viewpoint. It's never enough to prove that the defendant was enraged to kill. We have to ask a different question. We've got to ask whether defendant's reaction was reasonable as compared to the rest of society. Would others have been moved to kill in the same circumstances? Put a star next to this element. It is critical in an ordered society. We call this a normative standard that we're imposing. What would the rest of our community feel and do in this situation? That's the normative measure. If we didn't have it, our laws would all be manipulated by everyone with short fuses who claim to be provoked. Every person's hot button issue would be sufficient. You're a drunk and a liar, someone screams at me. Well, I say, how dare they? I become so enraged, I pull out my gun and shoot the person. So proving my passion, my heat of passion for element number 2, that's easy. You see me all inflamed. You see the steam coming out of my head. But now we got to step back and say, wait a second, would others agree? And the answer is, of course not. We can't exist in a society that way. We need to impose a measure on behavior by which we judge that action. It's never enough that our defendant was enraged and moved to kill. We have to ask, in this situation, would average people also have reacted the same way? Let's take a real-life example. Remember our case Guthrie, the case of the dish towel snapping victim? We know that every time the victim hit Guthrie with a dish towel, Guthrie got angrier and angrier. He was fuming through his shift. But could Guthrie claim adequate provocation? Could he say that being snapped with a dish towel would not only move him to kill, but it would move others to kill? The answer is hardly. Guthrie's reaction is too idiosyncratic. It's not something that would be universally understood by people. Guthrie would never meet element number 3. It's an odd phrase I'm using to say, would an average person be moved to kill? We don't actually mean what other people kill. In fact, you might be sitting here and going, I don't think most people kill generally. And it's true. Most people, in fact, don't kill under circumstances if they're not life-threatening, if they're not facing a deadly force against themselves or their family. Indeed, even when their child is molested, parents don't go out and kill the molester. They wait for the justice system to act. Here, though, we're asking a slightly more nuanced question. Here we're asking whether average people understand that someone could be moved to kill under these circumstances. We use the term adequate provocation in this element. Was there adequate provocation that would move an average person to kill? That too is an odd term. We need to remember that the word adequate doesn't mean justified or correct or right. It really means sufficient. Is there sufficient provocation, enough provocation, facing the defendant for the law to recognize the loss of self-control? In our discussion of the different jurisdictional views of heat of passion, we're going to see that there's a split of authority on what constitutes adequate provocation for element number 3. So we've examined the first 3 elements of heat of passion defense. That sets up the first phase of the defense, an intent to kill that's formed by a defendant who was subjectively in the heat of passion, and that this provocation was adequate to move an average, ordinary person to kill. Now we move to the next important qualifying element, element number 4. Even if the first 3 elements are met, there also must have been no reasonable time to cool off between the provocation and the killing. The killing has to be sudden. So even where the law acknowledges the adequacy of the provocation, it also asks a further requirement. It says that at some point, a person might be required to cool down. In our camp counselor hypothetical, the law is going to care whether defendant killed Carl the week he learned of the molestation or 2 years later. The law says that an average person could be moved to kill, but if there is a reasonable time to cool off and collect oneself, then defendant doesn't receive voluntary manslaughter. It's going to be murder. Defendant will have lost the mitigation. So we ask the element, is there no reasonable time to cool off? That's element number 4. Defendant's going to have to prove that. For this element as well, we're going to see a split in views on what it looks like. If defendant had time to cool off, where are we? If there's no mitigation, then at a minimum we're back to murder 2 with an intent to kill that's not justified, excused, or mitigated. And possibly we may be back up to murder 1 because premeditation is back on the table. The last element is the need for a causal connection. The essence of heat of passion is that defendant killed the person who provoked him. The idea behind voluntary manslaughter, and I gotta say this is fraught with difficulties, is that the victim in his or her actions has in some way caused the killing. Sometimes this kind of defense is called the victim deserved it defense. It's horrible sounding. But in this sense, this is why we call heat of passion defense a partial justification defense. It's not really justified, but the term arises from the belief that the victim, by his actions, caused the defendant become inflamed with passion. With this in mind, it's not uncommon for a defendant to malign the deceased victim at trial, to paint a picture for the jury of how bad the victim was and how the victim pushed the defendant to kill. You're going to see that in your cases.